there we are. I am on page. Oh, Pearl wants to get in. 1 second. I'm on page 406. Okay. I'm a little bit later than usual today. Okay, the point that we left off, I actually cannot remember, so I'm just going to start reading. Davison's strategy worked. Moses's acceptance of the nomination. Oh, right, he's running for governor. Made him the reactionaries' ally. But most newspapers responded, as did the Buffalo Evening News, which said, "None can say that Robert Moses is a Tory. His every act since entering public life has been dedicated to the best interests of the many." Even Baron Warren of the Times could only express puzzlement at the alliance. One of the odd turns of politics, he mused. Macy was robbed of the chance to portray the nomination struggle as one between an honest liberal and a candidate of the Power Trust. The battle at the GOP convention, held in Rochester in September, was bitter. The convention will go down in history as one of the most hectic the GOP has ever held, commented the Rochester Times-Union. But the result was foreordained, and Moses's nomination was cheered by both the press and public. "At last, an idealist in politics," said one typical letter to the editor. Under cover of the cheering, the state committee was able to meet immediately after the nomination and oust Macy as state chairman. The depth of the misunderstanding of Moses's philosophy was exemplified by an editorial in the World Telegram. Noting that the platform adopted by the convention was an uncompromising denunciation of the New Deal, the World Telegram said, "Mr. Moses may be able to fit himself to such a platform. We doubt it. With the reputation and record Moses has as a liberal, we don't see how he can." The World Telegram didn't know that Moses had written much of the platform himself. All right, so he's duping everyone into believing that he's really progressive when he's actually kind of not. Also, Pearl, I want her to come over here. Pearl, come say hi to the camera. Okay, she might not be that excited about it. She meowed a little bit, but here she is. Hi, Pearl. If the press was puzzled by Moses's nomination, it was to be dumbfounded by his campaign. For Robert Moses, as a candidate, was a phenomenon of a type not seen very often on the American political scene. It seemed as if he was trying to set some kind of record for antagonizing people, Windels recalls. The time at Moses's disposal was limited. In keeping with the custom of the era, the campaign ran for only 5 weeks, and he didn't waste a day of it. The element of the GOP most enthusiastic about his nomination was the young Republicans. The very evening after the convention, Davison hosted a cocktail party for them so that Moses could convert their enthusiasm into active support. But things didn't work out quite as Davison expected. They got into this argument, and he started calling them names, and they started calling him names, Davison recalls. My God, it ended up in a fearful row. Having thus rallied young Republicans to his standard, Moses turned his charm on their elders. Davison raised a massive war chest for the campaign, but, he recalls, Moses wouldn't consult with me. I must have been the most inactive campaign chairman in history as a result. Once the campaign started, we never saw him. He locked himself up in an ivory tower someplace, and we never saw his speeches until he gave them. And then he put Ray McNulty in our office, the state committee office, to keep an eye on us, I think. Well, didn't that just sit well with the boys? With his own party taken care of, Moses turned to the opposition. The fact that he was running as a Republican and against Lehman meant that he had to forfeit the support of the men and women he had worked with in government. Most of them, veterans of the Smith, Roosevelt, and Lehman administration, were Democrats. All of them were believers in increased government activity to promote social welfare, precisely the cause most hated by the old guard with which Moses had allied himself. Moses should not have expected their backing, but he did. And the way in which he asked for it, or rather demanded it, and his reaction when it was not forthcoming, were not particularly gracious. Wow, so he thinks he can just like suddenly become a Republican again and keep all his Democrat allies. There were a succession of unpleasant endings to pleasant dinner parties at which Bob and Mary were guests. I'm so excited for this section. We're about to hear about dinner party drama. This is great. Also, I keep trying to get the angle to be better so that you can see Pearl. Okay. One occurred at the Manhattan townhouse of Aaron Rabinowitz. Rabinowitz, a fabulously successful realtor turned philanthropist, was Lehman's partner in the state's first limited dividend housing corporation, which the two men had formed, at a cost to each of them of about $375,000, in an attempt to attract private capital to low-income housing. I was Moses's friend too, Rabinowitz recalls. We were very close, until one day he was at the house for dinner. He had just been nominated for governor. As the two men chatted outside the dining room after dessert, Moses asked, "You're going to help me become governor, aren't you?" Rabinowitz recalls, "I said, I can't. I was Lehman's partner. I was a Democrat." He turned and walked out without a word, and for 15 years, whenever we met, he wouldn't talk to me. Henry Moskowitz, Bell's husband and Moses' old boss on the Municipal Civil Service Commission, traditionally handled the foreign language press for the Democratic Party. Now, Moses asked Moskowitz to do the same job for him, the Republican candidate. Henry said what I said. I can't, Rabinowitz recalls. Moses never talked to him again. He owed that man a lot, but the lousy no good wouldn't even go to his funeral. The friendship of Moses' old associates, men like Joseph Proskauer and Bernard Sheentag, might have kept them from taking an active role in the campaign. But after one visit apiece from Moses, all of them were out working for and lending their powerful names to Lehman's re-election bid, and thereby emphasizing that Moses was opposing the liberal causes with which he had so long been identified. So he's really just like, clearly a lot of people that have known him for a long time do not want to support him. Then there was the press. Most candidates attempt to woo reporters covering the campaign. It took Moses exactly one press conference to turn them icily frigid toward his candidacy. Usually he's so good at winning over the press. This might have been surprising to those who had observed his long love affair with the press. But that love affair had endured only because he had never been exposed to the probing questioning to which reporters subject most public officials. His aides, who knew his sensitivity to even the most discreetly implied criticism, could have predicted what would happen when he was. Moses entered his first press conference smiling broadly and clasping the hands of old acquaintances in the press corps as he strode into the room. But practically the first question asked was the natural one, considering the confusion over how a liberal could be nominated by the most conservative elements of the Republican Party. "Mr. Moses, are you a protege of the old guard?" Which is obviously the answer is yes. Said the World Telegram that afternoon. The gubernatorial candidate drew his breath sharply, and there was a glitter in his eye. Jumping to his feet, jabbing his finger at the reporter who had asked the question, he heatedly declared, "Nobody has any strings on me," and demanded, "Have you asked the same question of Governor Lehman? Did you ask him if he is a protege of Tammany Hall? In what the World Telegram called a display of temper, he began lecturing the reporters on how to do their job and then announced belligerently that he would not take lying down anything that was said against him by newspapers. Moses carried out this threat with a vengeance. By the end of the campaign, he was spending a substantial part of his press conferences berating the press. And he had completely forfeited the sympathy with which most reporters had been prepared to view his candidacy. If there was a blunder that could be made, Moses made it. He wanted LaGuardia's support and assumed he would have it. After all, he was a member of LaGuardia's administration, and the mayor was a Republican. So Moses told the press he had it and announced a city hall meeting with LaGuardia at which he told reporters the mayor would announce it. Unfortunately, Moses had not bothered to check with LaGuardia. The mayor had been under pressure from President Roosevelt, with whom he was negotiating for federal relief funds to stay out of the gubernatorial campaign, but had indicated to Corporation Counsel Wendell's that he would campaign for Moses nonetheless. But Moses's taking his support for granted infuriated him. After the City Hall meeting, which lasted about an hour, LaGuardia said blandly, he'd make a good governor. Gosh, yes. But refused to say he would make a better governor than Lehman. And he remained seated firmly on the sidelines throughout the campaign. Moses had quietly ducked out of City Hall while reporters were questioning the mayor, but they cornered him later at 80 Center Street, and he could do nothing but admit that, as the Sun put it, he did not expect Mayor LaGuardia to make any campaign speeches in his behalf, as the mayor probably would be too busy with city affairs. Moses chose a tour of the upstate Republican heartland, where voters were bitterly opposed to any increase in governmental spending or power, to advocate the imposition of a state sales tax. And he didn't make the suggestion in just any upstate city. He did it in Binghamton, where the Chamber of Commerce had just finished collecting tens of thousands of names on anti-sales tax petitions. He chose Syracuse, center of Onondaga County farm country, as the place to attack Macy, a hero to farmers because of his battle against the utilities that forced them to pay exorbitant rates for hookups to power lines. Then Moses moved on to Rochester. Reported the World Telegram. Upstate audiences were surprised by the advocacy by Mr. Moses of a sales tax and startled when he struck at Mr. Macy. But they were left speechless last night at Convention Hall in Rochester when he casually gave his opinion that Herbert Hoover, still technically the party's national leader, failed to realize the need for action in fighting the Depression and had lost his strength of war days. As Moses moved on to Buffalo, fifth city on his itinerary, the World Telegram reported that he left behind a trail of bewildered and frightened party leaders. In 4 days, the upstate leaders say he has alienated 4 large blocks of Republican voters. Senate Majority Leader George R. Fearon of Syracuse had warned Davison not to nominate Moses. Don't do it, Fearon had said. I know Moses. Now, he told Davison, well, you've done it. Now we're going to lose the legislature. Truby scoffed. The Republicans hadn't done that since 1912. When he did Dean, D-E-I-G-N, is that Dean? Dane. When he did deign to discuss campaign plans with the men who had expected to help plan his campaign, Moses was firm. There was going to be no eating of bagels in Jewish neighborhoods or of sausages in Italian while photographers clicked away, he told them. He was determined to eschew the sideshows, which were a traditional part of political campaigns in the state that possessed the largest collection of ethnic blocs in America. There was, of course, something admirable in this determination, just as there was something admirable in Moses's enunciation of controversial views before groups hostile to those views. Moses's refusal to take the culinary road to the State House could be that's a funny phrase, the culinary road to the State House, could be interpreted as an indication that he was going to take the high road instead. that he was one candidate who would not pander to the people, but who would instead discuss important issues with them freely, frankly, and fully, and who would say what he believed, even if what he believed was that the state needed a sales tax. But such an interpretation turned out to be an inadequate explanation of Moses's campaign tactics. For the candidate, it turned out, was declining not only to pander to the people, but as much as possible, even to talk to them. And while the road he took in the campaign may not have been the culinary, it was certainly not the high either. Because Moses was less well known upstate than in and around New York City, his campaign managers suggested a heavier than usual crossroads campaign, the traditional gubernatorial candidate's automobile tour of upstate towns and villages. Moses replied that there wasn't going to be any crossroads campaign. He was not going to visit upstate towns and villages. He was not going to appear upstate at all, except in large cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse. And even in the cities, there would be no cocktail receptions, no coffee and cake receptions, no walking tours of shopping districts, no attempts at all to meet the public. His only appearances would be formal speeches. Then he told his campaign managers that he was going to follow the same policy in and around New York City. His only public appearances anywhere would be for formal speeches. And there would not be many of them. When he finished cutting down the schedule of speeches they had planned, his campaign managers realized that he was going to appear in public exactly 12 times. With the exception of those 12 occasions, his only communication with the voters he wanted to elect him to office would come through press releases. And if the campaign managers were at first dejected by Moses' insistence on keeping the number of his speeches small, they were soon to count it a blessing. For as Wendell's put it, every time he opened his mouth, he lost 10,000 votes. Moses' first speech, delivered at the Kismet Temple, a huge auditorium in Brooklyn, after he was escorted to the podium by a steel-helmeted American Legion band and cadre of the Old Guard, who had dined with him before the rally at their spiritual home, the Union League Club, he started the campaign off on the wrong foot. Moses has always been as much a fanatic on the subject of religion as his grandmother and mother. He had always insisted he was not Jewish. Okay, then we have a big asterisk, and I'm so excited to read this footnote. He based this assertion on the fact that he had been neither circumcised nor bar mitzvahed, ignoring the fact that, at the time, Jewish theologians generally agreed that Jewishness was a matter of birth rather than conviction, and that a Jew is anyone whose mother was a Jew. The definition that meant that Moses' grandmother could not escape being a Jew no matter how hard she tried, that Moses' mother could not avoid it either, and that neither could he. Then there's like a phrase, and it says, it's from the Talmud, even though he has sinned, converted to another faith, he is a Jew. By 1974, there would be more controversy on the point. Orthodox and conservative rabbis still held to the strict traditional view, but the Reform rabbinate allowed considerable discretion to its members. Some Reform rabbis held to the traditional view, but others felt that Jewishness was not a matter of birth, but of conviction. In the words of Rabbi Daniel Davis of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, "My standard is whether or not he wants to be a Jew." Said Davis, therefore, all you can say about Mr. Moses is that he had Jewish forebears, but did not really consider himself Jewish. Okay, so he always insisted that he was not Jewish. Also, look at Pearl right now. She's just chilling. Wow, it's hard to get her in the shot. He did everything he could to make his feelings clear. Oh, bye, David. He sent his daughters to an Episcopalian school, made disparaging remarks about qualities he felt characterized Jews, and when he learned that editors of the Jewish Encyclopedia were planning to include his biography in its pages, threatened to sue them for libel if it did. Okay, I love an encyclopedia mention. Also, hello. Sorry, okay, yeah. What has been happening is he is campaigning for governor. but things are going really badly. There was a quote that said every time he opened his mouth, he lost 10,000 votes, and he just, like, hated making speeches and meeting people, and he keeps doing all these faux pas. Like, he told the farmers how much he hated Macy, and they loved Macy, and he told what else? Oh, in, like, one of the cities, they had just really, like, railed against sales tax, and he, like, went to their city and announced, like, "We need a sales tax." So things were not going well, and then randomly we're talking about religion. That's why we talked about him being like, "I'm not a Jew," even though, like, his blood is. So that's what we're talking about right now. To a people that had suffered because of their religion and that was still suffering, in 1934, thousands of New York Jews were agonizing over the fate of relatives trapped in Germany. Moses' attempt to deny it was contemptible. Jews who knew of his feelings regarded him with bitterness. Members of the Temple El Emmanuel, the congregation that included most of the leaders of the Jewish community and therefore most of the men who were familiar with Moses' beliefs, laughed bitterly at the fact that he was seen at many funerals of Catholic Tammany politicians at St. Patrick's Cathedral, but almost never at funerals at Emmanuel El. City Comptroller Joseph D. McGoldrick, discussing Moses with a group of Jewish leaders, was shocked at the intensity of their feelings. To them, McGoldrick says, he was a Jew who had renounced his religion, and that was worse than anything. He was an apostate to his faith. But not many Jews were privy to Moses' feelings. Because of his name, they simply assumed that he was of their faith. Assumed it, that is, until his first speech, in which, apparently stung by a similar assumption by the press, he brought up the subject of religion himself and brought it up in a way deeply offensive to Jews. Okay, here's a quote. Moses didn't say, "I'm a Jew and I'm proud of it," as he should have, recalls Paul Windells. Instead, he said, "It's nobody's business what my religion is." And that got a lot of people very angry. Soon, in shabby shuls in the Bronx, as well as Temple Emmanuel El, or it's just Emmanuel, but it's okay. It's truly just Temple Emmanuel, and I was just pronouncing it weird. Sorry. um, you're getting behind. Oh, because of your thesis. I'm sorry. I think my summaries aren't very good either. I hope your thesis is going well though. Also, I feel like this part is, I mean, the main thing we've just learned about his character is that he, like, they chose him because he's actually very conservative, but people see him as the Parks guy, and so they think of him as more progressive. But I guess what we're seeing is that he really is very conservative, and when he's not totally in control of the narrative, like in press releases, he's not likable. That's something that we're kind of learning. Yeah. Succeeding speeches were even worse. Moses insisted on beginning many of them with an attempt to dispose of a false issue that he maintained the press was raising: the fact that his candidacy was a part of an attempt by the Power Trust or Old Guard to recapture control of the state. I can't remember if you were here for this, but the Power Trust and the Old Guard are just like the really rich conservative dudes on Long Island who used to be his enemies when he was trying to get the land to build the parkway, but now they like him because they want him to be the candidate. That's kind of like what we talked about earlier, but it seems like that's not obvious to people. Actually, the press had scarcely mentioned the issue. It was Moses, unable to endure even a hint of criticism, who kept bringing it up. There were press conferences, at least in the early stages of the campaign, while he was still holding press conferences, at which he was the only person who mentioned the phrase "Old Guard." His method of issue disposal, moreover, was not particularly convincing. It consisted of flat assertions. He was not the Old Guard or Power Trust candidate, he said on one occasion. Neither one of those stuffed shirts has any place in my life or acquaintance. On another, he stated without qualification, I am a liberal. Not which is he was running as a Republican. Not only were these assertions false, both before and after the election, Moses repeatedly declared without qualification, "I am a conservative." But they sounded false, since Moses was, of course, unable to explain who had obtained him the nomination if it was not the old guard. His assertion that he would regulate utilities as strictly as Lehman had an equally hollow ring, since he did not offer a single specific regulatory proposal. The only result of Moses' insistence on disposing of the utilities issue was to keep it fresh in voters' minds and to keep himself on the defensive about it. And Moses on the defensive was a more attractive sight than Moses on the attack. He had decided that the way to defeat Lehman was to destroy the governor's image. Unfortunately for this strategy, Lehman's case was that rarity, one in which the image was the man. The governor's intimates knew him as an individual somewhat less than brilliant and aware he was less than brilliant, but determined to make up for the shortcoming by hard work and dedication, and ambitious not for himself. He had not even wanted to be the governor, accepting the post only when Smith and Roosevelt, admiring his integrity and his dedication to liberal principles, insisted that he succeed them, but for the people. And the voters knew him the same way. Okay, I need to see. I'm going to look up a picture of Governor Lehman because I don't know what he looks like. New York Governor Lehman. And I'm so curious if he has anything to do with the cursed Lehman Brothers company. All right, he looks, wow. The picture of him is crazy. It was taken in 1949, but it totally looks like it could be one of the guys in Goodfellas. He is just like, he has really thick, like caterpillar eyebrows. He's smiling. He's holding a pipe, and like an old-timey pipe, like one of those, like, this is not a pipe looking pipes. He looks awesome. He definitely looks like the type of guy you would want to get a beer with. I'm looking up more things about him. Oh, and yeah, he definitely is the same as the Lehman Brothers financial services thing. It looks like his dad, okay, this is so funny. His dad's name was Mayer. So his dad is like Mayer Lehman, but that's just his name. And it's spelled Mayer, not O. And his dad, Mayer, who was not the mayor, he started the Lehman Brothers financial services for him. And it's so funny to think that like Mayor Lehman's son is Governor Lehman. Okay, anyway, let's see. Mayor Lehman. Okay. Oh yeah, I don't even know who the other Lehman brother is. You should fill us in. Actually, I am gonna click it. I want to know. Okay, so there was Hayam Lehman, who changed his name to Henry. He came to the US from Bavaria. And then his brother Emmanuel came. And then their younger brother Mayer came. So it's Mayer, Emmanuel, and Hayam, who became Henry. And Mayer's son is the governor. Okay. After the campaign, Moses himself would say that Lehman was essentially a cautious, dependable citizen of the old school, who carried on the work of Smith and Roosevelt without basic innovation, but who was enormously conscientious and hardworking. I would classify him as a distinguished governor. Herbert Lehman, Robert Moses would say after the campaign, was a man of fine character. Moses knew even better than most of Lehman's intimates that the only thing that mattered with Lehman was principle. It was Lehman who, running the state while Roosevelt was on vacation, had appointed Moses a Moreland commissioner to head a politically sensitive investigation into the bankrupt City Trust Company without bothering to clear it with the governor, because he thought Moses was the right man for the job. In a score of quarrels between Roosevelt and Moses, Lehman had stood up, quietly, nervously, but unshakably, for Moses. For no other reason than that he thought Moses was right. And Moses knew something that even most of Lehman's intimates didn't know, because Lehman never publicized it. He knew that Lehman, touched by the plight of the small depositors who had lost their savings in the City Trust debacle, had donated $1 million of his own money in an attempt to save the bank. There were no points at which the image could be attacked, truthfully, and Moses knew it, as his statements after the campaign reveal. Wow, it's crazy that a Lehman was the one that was saving the bank. But this was not after the campaign. This was the wait. But this was not after the campaign. This was the campaign, a campaign in which, at least for Moses, the prize was power. And the voters were soon reading headlines that said, Moses calls Lehman weak. Moses calls Lehman stupid. Moses called Lehman puppet forced to speak for Tammany. And the headlines didn't exaggerate the viciousness of Moses' attacks. In the speech in which he called Lehman weak, he also said that the governor had no guts and that he applies to every act the test of personal and political expediency. Puppet was one of the more polite terms that Moses employed in his accusations about Lehman and Tammany Hall. The governor is the respectable front for the Hall's crooked politicians, Moses said, the instrument of consolidating their power and furthering their ends. The governor, he said, is a miserable, sniveling type of man, contemptible. Repeatedly, Moses challenged Lehman to debate him. Moses was, after all, a past president of the Oxford Union. Just let him get slow, plodding Herbert Lehman on the platform, and he would tear him apart, he told aides. Lehman, advised by men who knew Moses well, Proskauer, Sheentag, and Moskowitz, for example, handled Moses just right. The governor ignored the invitation to debate, and to a large extent, he ignored Moses' charges. In fact, to a large extent, he ignored Moses, sticking strictly to a discussion of the issues in his record as he campaigned earnestly, 9 speeches in a single day, through the upstate towns and villages and the streets of New York City, in which Moses would not deign to appear. The governor mentioned Moses just 3 times in the first 3 weeks of the campaign, and every mention was devastating. In answer to Moses' charges that he was a puppet of Tammany Hall, the governor pointed out that he had left Moses in charge of the state park system and had increased his powers in other fields. Advice against the advice of Tammany leaders. Weak, he had fought for Moses' park policies against the Republican legislative leaders who were now backing Moses. The third time Lehman mentioned Moses was in a speech in Binghamton, whose householders paid monthly electric bills to the Associated Gas and Electric System, a utility which had recently been publicly disclosed to have paid Senator Warren Thayer $21,600 to kill measures that might have lowered its rates. The Republican candidate for governor undertook to eliminate certain issues from this campaign, Lehman said mildly. He attempts to dispose of the public utility problem by claiming it is not an issue. Surely, we can understand his desire to avoid the public utility issue. We can appreciate his anxiety to divert attention from the weakness of the record of his party. Unfortunately, however, candidates do not make issues. The people make the issues. It is the people themselves who determine those matters upon which they are entitled to honest report. No candidate can tell the people of the state of New York that it is not important to furnish electricity, gas, and telephone service to customers at low rates. Newspapers throughout the state agreed. Even the Brooklyn Eagle, whose editor, Cleveland Rogers, was one of Moses' most enthusiastic admirers, had to admit he cannot dispose of the so-called power issue by oversimplifying it, as he tried to do. Okay, I'm going to probably stop there. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Happy weekend. There's Pearl. She's such a good buddy today. Goodbye.